Picture this: an ancient tapestry, its threads woven centuries ago, glowing with the fiery scales of a dragon or the shimmering mane of a unicorn. These aren't just decorations or idle fantasies. To the people of the Middle Ages, these creatures were as real as the forests they feared and the stars they marveled at. They shaped kingdoms, inspired knights, and whispered warnings in the dark. And here's the astonishing truth: they never really left us. From the pages of our favorite fantasy novels to the blockbuster films that sweep us away, these mystical beasts still walk among us, alive in our collective imagination. But why? What is it about these medieval monsters that keeps us spellbound, even in a world of science and reason? The answer lies in something deeper than myth. It's about the human spirit. These creatures weren't just stories. They were mirrors reflecting our fears, hopes, and dreams. A dragon wasn't merely a monster hoarding gold. It was the embodiment of greed, chaos, or even untamed nature. A unicorn wasn't just a pretty horse with a horn. It symbolized purity, something rare and sacred in a world that often felt harsh and uncertain. And when we look at modern fantasy, from the dragons of Game of Thrones to the hippogriffs of Harry Potter, we're seeing the same timeless truths, retold for new generations. These beasts are more than entertainment. They're a bridge across centuries, connecting us to the people who first imagined them. So where did these legends begin? How did they evolve from medieval folklore into the icons we know today? That's the journey we're about to take together. We'll travel back to smoky taverns where bards spun tales of griffins and basilisks, to the workshops of artists who carved these creatures into cathedral walls. We'll uncover the real-world animals that might have inspired them, like how elephant skulls could have been mistaken for cyclops bones. And we'll see how these myths refuse to fade, instead transforming into the heart of modern storytelling. By the end, you'll see these creatures not just as figments of the past, but as living, breathing parts of who we are. Because the magic of medieval folklore isn't just in the beasts themselves, it's in the way they remind us that wonder is timeless. In the flickering light of a medieval hearth, stories weren't just tales, they were the fabric of life itself. Imagine a world without science textbooks or news headlines, where the line between reality and myth blurred like smoke curling upward. Folklore wasn't merely entertainment. It was how people made sense of everything from thunderstorms to sickness, from the virtues of courage to the dangers lurking beyond the village walls. A griffin with its eagle's beak and lion's claws wasn't just a fantastical hybrid. It became a lesson about the power of vigilance, guarding treasures both literal and spiritual. And the basilisk, whose gaze could turn men to stone, that was nature's way of saying some dangers are too deadly to even look upon. These stories thrived because they spoke to universal truths. Take the medieval bestiaries, illustrated books that described creatures real and imagined alongside moral teachings. A unicorn, for example, could only be tamed by a pure maiden, a metaphor for innocence overcoming wildness. As one 12th century writer put it, the beast is fierce, yet yields to gentleness as the soul yields to virtue. But before these tales were penned into parchment, they lived in the voices of bards and grandmothers, passed down like heirlooms. Around campfires and in crowded market squares, each retelling added new layers. A dragon's hoard grew larger, a mermaid's song more haunting. The details might shift, but the purpose remained: to teach, to warn, to wonder. What's fascinating is how these stories adapted to their times. A wolf wasn't just a predator. In folklore, it might become a werewolf, reflecting fears of the untamed wilderness, or even the darkness within human nature. And when the Black Death swept through Europe, legends of vengeful spirits surged, giving shape to the terror of an invisible plague. Folklore was never static. It was a living, breathing thing, evolving with every generation's anxieties and aspirations. Yet these creatures didn't stay confined to the Middle Ages. As ink replaced oral tradition, the griffins and basilisks began to shed their old roles, stepping into new stories where their symbolism could stretch even further. The same beasts that once taught peasants about morality would one day inspire poets, painters, and eventually filmmakers, but that's a transformation for another chapter. For now, remember this: when a medieval villager spoke of a dragon, they weren't just spinning a yarn. They were stitching meaning into the unknown, one myth at a time. Among all the creatures of medieval myth, none loomed larger both in size and symbolism than the dragon. Whether coiled around a castle tower in a European legend or soaring through the mists of an Eastern fable, dragons were the ultimate embodiment of raw, untamed power. But what's striking is how differently cultures interpreted them. In Europe, dragons were often villains, fiery engines of destruction, like the beast slain by St. George, representing chaos to be conquered by faith and order. Their wings cast shadows over entire villages, their breath reduced crops to ash, and their hordes lured greedy knights to doom. Listen to the old English epic, Beowulf, where the hero faces a dragon, wrathful and ravenous, its scales glittering like cursed gold. This wasn't just a monster, it was a force of nature, a test of a leader's courage. Yet travel east and dragons transformed. In China, they danced in festivals, symbols of wisdom and celestial power, their serpentine bodies weaving through clouds to bring rain. Japanese dragons guarded temples, their coiled forms etched into sacred gates. No fire-breathing terror here, these were creatures of balance, as much a part of the natural order as rivers or mountains. Even their anatomy told a story. Where European dragons roared with 3-clawed fury, imperial Chinese dragons bore 5 claws, a mark of the emperor's divine right. Art reveals just how deeply these differences ran. In medieval European manuscripts, dragons snarled with bat-like wings and forked tails, often locked in battle with saints or angels. The Welsh flag still flies the red dragon, a symbol of resistance, while Germanic tales spoke of the lindworm, a wingless, serpentine horror that slithered through rivers, drowning the unwary. Meanwhile, Byzantine mosaics showed dragons as twisted, almost decorative beasts, their bodies knotting like living chains. But why did this one creature wear so many faces? Perhaps because dragons were the ultimate canvas. They could be sin or salvation, disaster or destiny, depending on who told the tale. And though their scales might have faded from the skies, their legacy hasn't. From Smaug's greed to the benevolent dragons of Avatar: The Last Airbender, we're still rewriting their story, because dragons aren't just relics, they're reflections. And waiting just beyond their shadow lurks another beast, one with a gaze that turns flesh to stone. If dragons were the kings of brute strength, then the basilisk was the silent assassin of medieval myth, a creature so deadly, even meeting its gaze meant instant death. Ancient Roman writers like Pliny the Elder first described it as a serpent no longer than 12 fingers, yet so venomous that its hiss could scatter armies and its breath wither plants. But by the Middle Ages, the basilisk had evolved into something far more sinister, the king of serpents, crowned with a white spot or crest, as if mocking the divine right of earthly rulers. In a world where sight was sacred, where people believed vision worked by beams leaving the eyes, the idea of a monster that could kill with a look struck deep into the medieval psyche. Christian bestiaries latched onto this terror, turning the basilisk into a walking parable. Its very birth was unnatural, said to hatch from a rooster's egg, incubated by a toad or serpent. This twisted origin story made it a symbol of pride and corruption, a warning against the sin of arrogance. Some manuscripts claimed mirrors could repel it, not just as a practical defense, but as a metaphor, vanity reflecting its own destruction. Art from the period often showed it as a grotesque hybrid, part rooster, part snake, its claws clutching the ground as if the earth itself recoiled from its touch. A 15th century text shuddered, "Where it walks, the grass blackens, where it sleeps, the stones crack." Yet the basilisk's power wasn't just in its lethality, it was in its contradictions. Unlike dragons, which could be challenged in battle, the basilisk couldn't be fought head-on. It forced heroes to rely on wit, like carrying weasels believed to be its only natural enemy, or using reflections to turn its gaze against itself. This made it a uniquely psychological monster, a reminder that some evils can't be conquered by strength alone. And then there's the twist. Just as the basilisk embodied humanity's darkest fears, another creature emerged as its radiant opposite. Where the basilisk killed with a look, the unicorn healed with a touch. Where one represented corruption, the other became a beacon of purity, a contrast so striking, it's no wonder these two beasts stalked the same folklore forest. But that's a tale for another moment. For now, remember the basilisk not just as a monster, but as a mirror. In a world where plagues could strike without warning and kings ruled by divine claim, sometimes the greatest terror wasn't a claw or fang, but the unseen waiting to meet your eye. The unicorn seemed to step straight from a dream, a creature so pure, medieval artists often painted it glowing like moonlight on snow. Unlike the dragon's fury or the basilisk's venom, this beast radiated gentleness, its single spiraled horn said to cleanse poisoned waters with a touch. But don't let its delicate appearance fool you. The unicorn was far more than a pretty symbol, it was a paradox, wrapped in sacred allegory and drenched in blood. Consider the famous Lady and the Unicorn tapestries, woven in the late 15th century. At first glance, they depict a serene maiden stroking the creature's mane, surrounded by blooming flowers. But look closer. Each tapestry represents one of the senses: taste, touch, smell, with the unicorn as both participant and prize. Some scholars believe the scenes aren't just about physical sensation, but about taming the wildness within the human soul. The maiden's lap becomes a throne, her fingers not just petting but claiming dominion over nature's untamed magic. And that horn, in medieval medicine, it was ground into powders believed to cure fevers or detect toxins, though what nobles actually bought was often narwhal tusk, sold at prices that could bankrupt a merchant. Yet for all its grace, the unicorn's mythology was steeped in violence. Hunters could never capture it through force, the tales warned, only through deceit. A young virgin had to sit alone in the woods, luring the creature to lay its head in her lap. Then, as it slept, the hunters would strike. This brutal imagery wasn't just about the chase, it carried layers of meaning. In Christian texts, the unicorn became a symbol of Christ, pure, divine, and willingly sacrificed. The Virgin, she stood for Mary, and the hunters represented humanity's sins. Even the horn echoed the spear that pierced Christ's side, its purifying power mirroring spiritual redemption. What makes the unicorn so fascinating is how it balanced fragility and strength. Its horn could neutralize poison, yet it died at the hands of treachery. It symbolized innocence, yet its stories were tangled with bloodshed. And perhaps that's why it endured, not as a naive fantasy, but as a mirror to the contradictions of the medieval world. Where faith demanded purity, life demanded survival. Where nature offered wonder, men sought control. But just as the unicorn blended light and shadow, another creature walked the line between beauty and terror, one whose feathers shimmered with the colors of dawn, yet whose cry heralded storms. The phoenix didn't just rise from ashes, It carried the weight of empires in its wings. The mermaid's song was said to carry for miles across the waves, a melody so haunting, sailors would forget their homes, their families, even the feel of solid ground beneath their feet. Medieval sailors whispered of these creatures with equal parts longing and dread, for the mermaid was no simple fish-tailed beauty. She was the ocean's paradox, a symbol of desire and destruction, her voice luring ships onto jagged rocks as surely as any storm. In one 14th century logbook, a captain described spotting a mermaid off the coast of Normandy, her hair dark as seaweed, her eyes holding the depth of drowned men. He ordered the crew to plug their ears with wax, a direct echo of Odysseus's encounter with the sirens centuries earlier. But where the ancient sirens were winged horrors, medieval mermaids took on a more deceptive allure, human enough to feel familiar, yet alien enough to embody the sea's merciless unknown. Church carvings from the period reveal just how deeply this duality ran. In Exeter Cathedral, a mermaid carved into the choir stalls holds a mirror and comb, symbols of vanity, yet her tail twists around a sinking ship. This wasn't just decoration, it was a warning. The ocean was the last great wilderness of the medieval world, a place where God's order seemed to fray at the edges. Mermaids became the personification of that chaos, their beauty masking the hunger beneath. Even their anatomy held meaning. Half human, they whispered of the thin line between civilization and savagery, while their fish halves spoke of the cold, unreachable depths where sunlight never touched. Yet mermaids weren't always omens. In heraldry, they appeared as emblems of maritime cities, their dual nature reflecting the balance between trade's rewards and its risks. A 15th century merchants' guild in Brittany adopted a mermaid crest, her mirror said to reflect truth to those who dared sail far. Here, she wasn't a killer but a guide, though one that demanded respect. This tension between peril and promise made mermaids endlessly adaptable. When the Black Death ravaged coastal towns, some saw them as plague bringers, their songs now dirges. Elsewhere, fishermen left offerings of trinkets on beaches, hoping to win their favor for calm seas. What's striking is how little these creatures resembled the sweet-natured Ariel of later tales. Medieval mermaids were shapeshifters in every sense, their stories morphing to mirror humanity's changing relationship with the sea. And as explorers later ventured into uncharted waters, the mermaid's legend would stretch yet again, just as another creature's shadow stretched over the forests of Europe. For where the mermaid ruled the waves, the werewolf claimed the wilderness, and its story was written in moonlight and blood. Under the pale glow of a full moon, the line between man and beast blurred into something far more terrifying than any dragon or basilisk the werewolf. Medieval Europe trembled at stories of these creatures, not just because they were monsters, but because they were once neighbors, friends, even family. A werewolf wasn't born in some distant cave. It walked among villagers by day, only to shed its skin when darkness fell. This wasn't just folklore, it was a chilling exploration of humanity's darkest question: what if the monster is us? Take the case of Peter Stump, a 16th century German farmer whose trial shocked Europe. Accused of lycanthropy, the ability to transform into a wolf, Stump allegedly confessed to over a decade of murders, his claws tearing flesh like rotten fruit. Woodcuts from the trial show him mid-transformation, his human face twisting into a snout, his hands sprouting talons. But look closer. The imagery drips with symbolism. Stump wears a collar, a detail suggesting his crimes weren't just violence, but a rebellion against society's chains. His story wasn't unique. Across France and the Holy Roman Empire, hundreds faced similar accusations, often tied to periods of famine or plague. Where wolves became scapegoats for unexplainable horrors, their existence proof that evil could wear a human face. Yet the wolf wasn't always a villain. In stark contrast to these tales stood figures like Saint Francis of Assisi, who famously preached to wolves as brothers. A 13th century fresco shows him taming the wolf of Gubbio, not with a sword, but with compassion, the creature laying its head in his hands like a chastened child. Here, the wolf wasn't a monster, it was a soul to be redeemed, a metaphor for nature's wildness yielding to grace. This duality reveals the medieval mind's struggle. The wolf could embody both the devil's savagery and God's untamed creation, depending on who told the tale. Art tells the story best. Early woodcuts depict werewolves as hulking hybrids, their human eyes pleading from animal faces, a visual cry against the beast within. But by the Renaissance, the imagery shifted. Werewolves became more human, their transformations framed as curses rather than sins, their suffering etched into every line. This wasn't just artistic evolution, it reflected changing fears. As forests were cleared and villages grew, the wilderness no longer loomed as an external threat. The real danger, these later works whispered, came from the darkness inside civilized men. And just as the werewolf embodied earthly fears, another creature soared above them literally. High above the tangled forests and shadowed villages, the phoenix burned and rose anew, its wings trailing sparks like fallen stars. If the werewolf was a prisoner of the moon's cycles, the phoenix was time's conqueror, its rebirth a promise that not all transformations ended in bloodshed. But that's a tale written in fire, not fur high on cathedral spires and woven into royal banners. The griffin stood as medieval Europe's ultimate sentinel, a creature so majestic, it borrowed the eagle's piercing gaze and the lion's unshakable courage. But this wasn't just a random mashup of traits. Every detail of the griffin's design whispered a purpose. The eagle, ruler of the skies, symbolized divine vision, while the lion, king of the earth, embodied raw strength. Together, they formed a guardian fit for the most sacred treasures, both literal and spiritual. Long before medieval knights etched griffins onto their shields, these creatures soared through ancient Persian myths as protectors of the divine. The Achaemenid Empire carved them into palace walls, their talons clutching golden vessels, a silent warning to thieves and invaders alike. By the time these stories reached Europe, the griffin had taken on new layers of meaning. Christian scholars saw in its dual nature a reflection of Christ's divinity and humanity, its wings stretching toward heaven while its paws remained grounded in the earthly realm. A 12th century bestiary put it plainly, as the griffin guards its hoard, so too does the Lord guard the souls of the faithful. But where the griffin truly thrived was in the language of power. Kings and nobles adopted it as their emblem, its image stamped onto coins and sewn into tapestries. In the vaulted halls of Westminster Abbey, stone griffins perch with watchful eyes, their presence a silent vow of protection. Heraldry turned them into living metaphors when a griffin appeared on a family crest. It signaled not just nobility, but an unbreakable duty to defend what was sacred. The Medici family, rulers of Renaissance Florence, used the griffin as their symbol, pairing it with the motto Semper, meaning always, a promise of eternal vigilance. Yet for all its grandeur, the griffin also sparked tales of adventure. Medieval travelers like Sir John Manville spun yarns of Scythian mountains where griffins hoarded gold, their nests littered with gems, bright enough to blind a man. Miners claimed the creatures would attack anyone who dared steal even a pebble, their screams echoing through the valleys like thunder. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were cautionary tales about the price of greed, wrapped in the glittering allure of the unknown. What makes the griffin so enduring is its duality. It's both protector and avenger, a bridge between worlds. But just as it stood for honor, another creature slithered into the medieval imagination, one that wore lies as easily as skin. Where the griffin soared with open pride, the doppelganger lurked in shadows, its greatest weapon not claws or wings, but deception so perfect, even your own reflection might betray you. The chimera wasn't just a monster, it was a walking blasphemy, its very existence defying nature's rules. Picture this: a lion's muscular forequarters, a goat's head erupting from its spine, and a serpent coiled where the tail should be, its fangs dripping venom. This nightmare hybrid first reared its three heads in Greek mythology, breathing fire across Lycia until the hero Bellerophon struck it down from Pegasus's back. But by the Middle Ages, the chimera had slithered into new nightmares, transformed by Christian scholars into a warning against heresy. In their eyes, its mismatched body became the ultimate symbol of disorder, a perversion of God's design. Medieval bestiaries seized on this fear, their pages filled with grotesque illustrations where the chimera's goat head often wore a human-like expression of agony, as if the creature itself suffered from its own unnatural state. One 12th century manuscript described it as three devils in one flesh, its lion half representing pride, the goat lust, and the serpent deceit. The message was clear: sin could stitch itself into something monstrous, something that couldn't exist without defiance of divine law. Even its fiery breath took on new meaning, likened to the flames of hell that awaited those who strayed from doctrine. Artists amplified this terror through chilling details. In classical Greek pottery, the chimera had been dynamic but almost elegant, its parts flowing together like a twisted masterpiece. Medieval illuminations, though, turned it into a shuddering collage, the lion's mane matted with filth, the goat's eyes rolling wildly, the serpent's body peeling away as if barely attached. This wasn't just a beast, it was a visual sermon, a reminder that tampering with nature's boundaries invited chaos. Yet the chimera's legacy wasn't all fire and brimstone. Some alchemists saw it differently, interpreting its hybrid form as a riddle of transformation, a symbol of the philosopher's stone's power to unite opposing elements. A cryptic 15th century text even claimed the creature's three parts mirrored the stages of spiritual enlightenment: the lion's strength for purging sin, the goat's endurance for the climb toward wisdom, and the serpent's cunning to navigate temptation. Here, the chimera wasn't a monster to fear, but a puzzle to decode, its body a map of alchemical secrets. But for every scholar who saw hidden meaning, villagers whispered of real dangers. When livestock vanished or crops failed, some swore they'd glimpsed patchwork shapes in the mist, not quite lion, not quite goat, but something worse. Because the true horror of the chimera wasn't just its form, it was the idea that nature itself could unravel, leaving behind a world where nothing fit together as it should. And as peasants crossed themselves against the dark, another creature watched from the tree line, its antlers tangled with vines, its eyes glowing like embers in the underbrush amid the stone saints and stern-faced angels of medieval cathedrals. One figure stands out not for its piety, but for its wild, untamed presence. The Green Man peers from capitals and choir stalls, his face a riot of leaves, vines bursting from his mouth like a silent shout. Part human, part foliage, he's neither fully man nor plant, but something in between, a living embodiment of nature's relentless force. Unlike dragons or unicorns, he doesn't roar or gallop. His power is quieter, deeper, rooted in the cycle of decay and regrowth. To spot him is to glimpse the medieval world's uneasy truce between the sacred and the primal. Was he a pagan relic smuggled into Christian spaces, or a symbol of God's creation flourishing anew? The debate still simmers. In the shadowy corners of Chartres Cathedral, his leafy visage stares down beside scenes of the Last Judgment, as if asking whether heaven itself might sprout from the earth. Some scholars point to older traditions like the Celtic Cernunnos, antlered god of the forest. arguing that stonemasons kept ancient beliefs alive under the church's watchful eye. Others insist he's purely Christian, a representation of Adam, whose sin condemned him to toil among thorns, or even Christ as the vine mentioned in Scripture. One 15th century manuscript from York describes him as the breath of the living world, a phrase that could sway either way. Look closer at his depictions and the contradictions multiply. In Rosslyn Chapel, his expression is almost serene, tendrils curling like a monk's beard. But on a London pub sign from the same era, he's a grinning trickster, acorns nested in his eyebrows. This duality followed him into later folklore as Jack in the Green, a dancing figure covered in foliage who led May Day processions half deity, half drunken reveler. The Puritans loathed him, calling his festivals devil's work, yet villagers kept weaving his effigies, stubborn as ivy on a gravestone. Perhaps his endurance lies in that very ambiguity. The Green Man doesn't preach or threaten. He simply is, a reminder that stone walls and stained glass can't fully separate humanity from the soil it sprang from. And as his vines twist into the shadows of the cathedral, another kind of creature stirs, one not of sunlight and leaves, but of caves and creeping dread. Where the Green Man symbolizes life's persistence, the beasts of the underworld whisper of what waits beneath. The howl of a hellhound wasn't just a sound, it was a death sentence. Imagine standing in a moonlit graveyard when the air itself seems to shudder, and from the mist lumbers a beast with eyes like burning coals, its breath reeking of sulfur. This was no ordinary wolf. In medieval Europe, hellhounds were the ultimate omen, their appearances scribbled into chronicles alongside records of plagues and wars. Take Black Shuck, the monstrous dog said to haunt the coasts of East Anglia. Eyewitnesses in the 16th century described it as taller than a man, its single eye glowing red as a forge, its paws leaving scorched marks on church doors. When it vanished, the townsfolk braced for disaster, and within days, a storm drowned half the fishing fleet. Coincidence? To them, it was prophecy written in claw marks. But here's the twist, not all hellhounds brought pure destruction. In Welsh mythology, the CW circumflexen an hounds of the otherworld were spectral hunters with coats white as bone. Their baying signaled death, yes, but also transition. They didn't just drag souls to torment, they escorted them to Anon, the Welsh afterlife, where feasts and music awaited. Farmers who heard their cries would cross themselves, yet some whispered gratitude these hounds weren't just punishers, but guides for those whose time had come. This duality fascinated medieval scholars. A 14th century monk's marginalia depicts a hellhound with a key in its jaws, an eerie nod to its role as both jailer and gatekeeper of the unseen world. Artists amplified these contradictions. In English woodcuts, hellhounds snarled with saliva-dripping fangs, often chained to the devil's throne like living weapons. Yet in Breton tapestries, they appeared almost noble, their ghostly forms weaving between standing stones as if guarding ancient secrets. Even their names carried weight. Black Shuck's title might stem from the Old English skaka, meaning demon, while the CW circumflexen Anon's master was Aron, a king of the dead who ruled with eerie fairness. These weren't mindless monsters, they were enforcers of cosmic balance, their presence a reminder that death wasn't an end but a reckoning. So why did these creatures haunt the medieval imagination so vividly? Perhaps because they embodied the era's deepest anxieties. In a world where disease could erase a village by sunrise and justice was often arbitrary, the hellhound offered a grim comfort. Evil might roam, but nothing escaped judgment forever. Its growl was the sound of inevitability, a force as old as sin itself. And as its echo fades into the mist, another figure emerges from the shadows, this one not snarling but smiling. Where the hellhound dealt in fear, the Sphinx traded in riddles, her wings rustling with the weight of unspoken truths. The phoenix didn't just die, it chose to burn. Flames would engulf its wings in a blaze so brilliant, medieval poets claimed it outshone the sun itself. Yet from those ashes, the creature would rise anew, reborn with feathers glowing like molten gold. This wasn't just a spectacle, it was the ultimate allegory of hope, a promise that even destruction could birth something greater. But the phoenix's journey to becoming a medieval Christian icon began far from Europe's cloisters and cathedrals. Its story first took flight in the scorching sands of Egypt, where it was known as the Benue bird, a heron-like being linked to the rising sun and the Nile's life-giving floods. Temple carvings show it perched atop obelisks, its cry heralding the dawn of a new era. By the time this myth reached medieval Europe, it had shed its Egyptian plumage for something far more symbolic. Christian scholars seized upon the phoenix's cycle of death and rebirth, weaving it into sermons as proof of Christ's resurrection. A 12th century bestiary from Aberdeen declares, "As the phoenix is consumed by fire yet returns unbroken, so too did the Savior rise on the third day." The fiery pyre became the cross, the ashes the tomb, and the reborn bird a winged testament to divine triumph. Even the Exeter Book, a 10th century collection of Old English poetry, describes the phoenix's renewal in language dripping with liturgical reverence. From its bones life blossoms anew as grace springs from sacrifice. Art transformed the phoenix into a kaleidoscope of meaning. In Ravenna's Basilica of Sant'Apollinare Nuovo, 6th century mosaics depict it not as a solitary wonder, but surrounded by peacocks and doves, a visual chorus of immortality. Its feathers, often rendered in shimmering gold leaf, seem to catch the light of stained glass windows, as if the bird itself were a living stained glass sermon. Yet for all its sacred ties, the phoenix never lost its edge of mystery. Alchemists scribbled notes about its ashes, believing they could turn lead into gold. Travelers' tales spoke of it nesting in Arabian incense trees, its wings perfuming the wind with myrrh. What makes the phoenix so captivating is its refusal to fit neatly into any single box. It's both a pagan wonder and a Christian parable, a scientific curiosity and a poetic muse. But just as its flames defy categorization, another creature lurks in the medieval shadows, one that mocks all attempts to define it. Where the phoenix soars with purpose, the basilisk slithers between meanings, its very existence a riddle wrapped in scales. If the basilisk was death in serpent skin, the cockatrice was its feathered nightmare, a creature born from one of nature's most bizarre recipes. Medieval bestiaries claimed it began life as a rooster's egg, but not just any egg. This one had to be laid under a waxing moon, then left in a dung heap for a toad or serpent to incubate. The result, a monstrosity with the body of a dragon, the head of a rooster, and wings that crackled like dry parchment. Unlike the basilisk's serpentine stealth, the cockatrice marched with a predator's pride, its scarlet comb a mockery of royal crowns. Its breath could wilt crops, its gaze turn flesh to stone, but what truly set it apart was its voice. Witnesses swore its crow sounded like a rusty hinge, a sound that brought fever to those who heard it. The confusion between cockatrice and basilisk runs deep. Even medieval scholars debated their differences. Some manuscripts labeled them interchangeably, while others insisted the cockatrice was the basilisk's winged cousin. A 15th century alchemist's journal draws the line vividly. The basilisk slithers, the cockatrice struts. One is a knife in the dark, the other a sword raised high. This distinction bled into art. Where the basilisk coiled in shadows, the cockatrice often stood atop treasure chests or ruined castles, its talons gripping conquests like a tyrant on a throne. Yet for all its terror, the cockatrice had a curious weakness. weasels. Folklore claimed these small, fierce creatures were immune to its gaze and would attack relentlessly, their bites dripping with venom of their own. This odd detail wasn't just practical advice, it was symbolic. The weasel, often associated with purity in medieval lore, thanks to myths about it conceiving through the ear, became divine justice in furry form. A tapestry in Burgundy shows just this scene, a weasel sinking its teeth into a cockatrice's throat, while angels cheer from the margins. Heraldry turned the cockatrice into a walking cautionary tale. When it appeared on coats of arms, which it did, though rarely, it signaled a family's triumph over vice or heresy. The De Vere family, powerful English nobles, used it as a badge not to celebrate the creature, but to declare they'd slain its likeness in the hearts of men. Even its name carried weight. Cockatrice likely stems from the Latin cockatrix, a twist on crocodile, linking it to another beast medieval Europeans found both fascinating and alien. But the cockatrice's legacy wasn't all fire and brimstone. In some remote villages, farmers would nail rooster eggs to barn doors not out of fear, but as a charm. The logic was twisted yet poetic. If the egg couldn't hatch, the monster couldn't walk. It was a small act of defiance, a way to tame the unknown with a hammer and a prayer. As the cockatrice's crow fades from our ears, another creature takes wing, one that needed no cursed eggs to claim its place in legend. High above the tangled forests where hellhounds prowled and chimeras lurked, the majestic rock spread its wings, casting shadows large enough to darken entire villages. But that's a tale that begins not in a dung heap, but in the pages of a merchant's travelogue, where the line between fact and fable flutters like a feather in the wind. The rock didn't just fly, it blotted out the sun. Imagine a bird so vast, its wingspan stretched wider than a ship's sails, its talons capable of snatching an elephant from the ground as effortlessly as a hawk plucking a mouse. This wasn't just a creature of myth. It was a force of nature, born from the tales of Arab sailors and merchants who whispered of its existence across the Indian Ocean. By the time Marco Polo penned his travels in the 13th century, the rock had become legend, its shadow looming over both maps and imaginations. Polo's account, though likely garbled from descriptions of the now extinct elephant bird of Madagascar, claimed the rock's feathers measured 12 paces long, and its eggs were as large as domes. To medieval Europeans, this wasn't just a bird. It was proof that the world still held wonders too colossal to comprehend. What made the rock so captivating was its sheer audacity. Unlike dragons or griffins, which carried symbolic weight, the rock was pure spectacle, a creature whose very existence defied the limits of the natural world. Persian geographers like Al-Qazwini described it nesting on mountain peaks so high, clouds gathered beneath its wings. In the Arabian Nights, Sinbad the sailor witnesses a rock's egg shimmering like a pearl the size of a palace, only to hatch into a fledgling whose cries shake the earth. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were coping mechanisms for a world still largely uncharted. When faced with the vastness of deserts and seas, the rock became a way to personify nature's grandeur and its indifference. Yet the rock's influence didn't stop at the edges of medieval maps. Across the Atlantic, indigenous tribes spoke of the thunderbird, a celestial being whose wings summoned storms and whose eyes flashed lightning. Though separated by oceans, the parallels are striking. Both creatures embodied the raw power of the skies. Both served as cultural touchstones for humanity's smallness in the face of nature's might. Even today, traces of the rock linger in modern fantasy, from the giant eagles of the Lord of the Rings to the towering ruck of One Piece, proving that some legends are too vast to fade. But the rock wasn't the only colossus haunting the medieval mind. If the skies held terrors of scale and ferocity, the earth's depths hid beasts of a different kind, ones that slithered through caves and whispered in the dark. Where the rock ruled the heavens, the creatures of the underworld thrived in the absence of light, their stories etched into the stone of cathedral crypts and miners' nightmares beneath the rolling hills of England. Something ancient stirred, not with wings or flaming breath, but with a slow, sinuous power that shook the earth itself. The worm, or worm as it was often called, bore little resemblance to the dragons of castles and crowns. This was a creature of mud and moss, its scaled body as thick as an oak, its jaws dripping with venom that could poison entire rivers. Unlike the soaring dragons of legend, the worm was deeply rooted in place, its story woven into the very soil of local villages. Take the lambton worm, a beast said to have terrorized County Durham after a young fisherman pulled it from the Were River as a harmless-looking eel. By nightfall, it had grown to monstrous proportions, coiling around hills and crushing livestock in its grip. Ballads from the 15th century describe its reign of terror. 9 miles it stretched from end to end, its breath a stench of death unkenned. What makes the worm so fascinating is how tightly its fate was tied to the land it haunted. While dragons symbolized universal threats, greed, chaos, divine punishment, the worm was personal. It wasn't a king's problem, it was a village's nightmare. In Knotlow, Derbyshire, locals spoke of a worm so vast its coils formed the hills themselves, its slumbering body shaping the landscape. To slay it required not just bravery but cunning. The lambton worm's demise came only when its captor, now a repentant knight, armored himself in spikes and let the creature's crushing embrace become its undoing. Folktales like these weren't just entertainment, they were lessons in resilience. The worm was a trial, a test of a community's ingenuity and courage. Even its weaknesses reflected local wisdom. Some legends claimed worms could regenerate unless burned, their ashes scattered to the wind. Others insisted they'd die only if their severed heads were kept apart, a metaphor for fracturing the cycle of harm. In ballads like The Laidly Worm of Spindleston Hugh, the creature's curse is broken not by a blade but by a kiss, transforming it back into a princess, her monstrous form a result of betrayal. Here, the worm wasn't just a foe, it was a cry for compassion, a reminder that some evils stem from wounds left untended. Yet for all its earthbound terror, the worm shared something profound with its celestial counterparts. Like the dragons of the skies, it represented the unknown, the churn of the soil after floods, the sudden collapse of a hillside, the inexplicable blight on crops. To conquer, it was to assert control over the chaotic forces that govern daily life. And as the last echoes of worm-slaying ballads fade, our gaze lifts from the mud to the stars, where another kind of serpent slithers, not through rivers or fields, but across the night sky itself. The celestial dragon of myth didn't guard gold or poison wells. It carried the weight of destiny in its constellation coils, its story written in light older than castles, older than kings, in the hushed valleys of Wales, where mist clings to the hills like a second skin. Whispers lingered of a creature that shunned the daylight, the moon-eyed beast. Unlike dragons or griffins, this being left no scorched earth or claw marks in stone. It was a phantom of the night, its eyes said to glow like pale lanterns, adapted to see in darkness but blinded by the sun. Medieval villagers spoke of it in fragments, a shadow moving through the trees, a rustle in the heather where no wind blew. Some claimed it built strange stone circles under the cover of darkness, while others swore it could mimic the calls of owls to lure the unwary. What's fascinating isn't just the creature itself, but why it existed in the imagination at all. The moon-eyed beast filled the gaps in a world without scientific explanations. When livestock vanished or crops failed under the cover of night, folklore provided answers where knowledge fell short. A 12th century Welsh manuscript, its margins crammed with sketches of odd creatures, describes the beast as a dweller of thresholds, neither man nor animal, that walks when the moon governs the sky. This wasn't mere superstition, it was a way to personify the unknown, to give shape to the unease that crept in when the sun dipped below the horizon. Even the creature's alleged blindness by daylight carried symbolic weight, a metaphor for the limits of human understanding, how some truths remain just out of sight. Cryptid hunters today might recognize something familiar in these tales. The moon-eyed beast's elusive nature, its fragmentary sightings, its ties to specific landscapes echoes modern legends like Bigfoot or the Mothman. Both medieval and contemporary cryptids emerge from the same human impulse to explain the unexplained, to populate the shadows with something tangible. But where Bigfoot is often framed as a biological oddity, the moon-eyed beast was woven into the spiritual fabric of its environment. It wasn't just a mystery, it was a keeper of boundaries, a reminder that some realms belonged to the night alone. Artists and scribes immortalized these beings in the margins of manuscripts, their sketches curling around sacred texts like vines. A 15th century psalter from Aberystwyth shows a moon-eyed beast peering from behind a decorated letter, its pupils wide as coins, its body half hidden by foliage. These weren't doodles, they were acknowledgments of a world beyond scripture where the divine and the uncanny coexisted. Even the creature's name evolved over time. In some dialects it was called Lygad Wailuad, moon's eye, a poetic nod to its nocturnal reign. Fast forward to modern media, and the legacy of these nocturnal enigmas is everywhere. From the glowing-eyed creatures of Pan's labyrinth to the shadowy beings in Stranger Things, the moon-eyed beast's DNA lingers in stories that blur the line between wonder and dread. Its greatest trick wasn't hiding in the dark, it was slipping into our collective imagination, proving that the oldest monsters are often the hardest to forget. And as the first rays of dawn creep over those Welsh hills, another creature stirs, this one not bound by night or day, but by something far older. The weight of prophecy itself. Dragons no longer just guard castles in medieval tapestries. They soar across the screens of our favorite fantasies, breathing fire into modern myths. Take Daenerys Targaryen's dragons in Game of Thrones. These aren't the mindless terrors of old. They're symbols of power, loyalty, and rebellion, their scales gleaming with political weight as much as fantasy. George R.R. Martin didn't just borrow the dragon's shape from medieval lore, he reshaped its soul, turning it from a hoarder of gold to a living weapon that could topple empires. Yet traces of the past linger. Drogon's wrath mirrors the dragons of Beowulf, creatures whose fury demanded a hero's sacrifice. The difference, now the dragon isn't always the villain, sometimes it's the throne itself. J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series pulled creatures straight from the pages of medieval bestiaries but gave them new roles. Hippogriffs, once feared as omens in old woodcuts, became majestic allies like Buckbeak, their dignity echoing the griffins of heraldry. Even the Basilisk in the Chamber of Secrets kept its lethal gaze but gained a backstory, a weapon bred by Salazar Slytherin, twisting the medieval King of Serpents into a purebloods nightmare. Rowling's genius was in making these beasts feel real to readers, as if they'd always belonged in a world of wands and wizardry. Then there's Tolkien, the grand architect of modern fantasy's menagerie. His Balrog, a fiery demon of shadow and flame, owes its terror to the demons of Old English texts, while the felled beasts ridden by ringwraiths evoke the draconic mounts of Norse sagas. Tolkien didn't just borrow, he wove entire taxonomies, giving dragons like Smaug the cunning of Germanic worms and the greed of biblical leviathans. His drafts reveal margins crammed with notes on medieval bestiaries, proving he saw these creatures not as decorations, but as heirs to a mythic legacy. Today, CGI and concept art have resurrected these beasts in ways parchment never could. The dragons of House of the Dragon flex muscles under animated scales, their roars vibrating through surround sound. Video games like The Witcher 3 let players face griffins in battles where every feather reacts to wind. Yet the magic isn't just in the technology, it's in the psychology. Why do these creatures still grip us? Carl Jung might argue they're archetypes buried deep in our collective unconscious. The dragon isn't just a monster, it's the shadow of our own ambition. The unicorn isn't just a pretty legend, it's the purity we fear we've lost. From medieval villagers whispering of basilisks to gamers streaming epic dragon fights, these beasts have never truly left us. They've simply shed their old skins, adapting to new stories and new fears, and as long as we dream, they'll keep evolving, forever perched on the edge of myth and screen. Carl Jung once wrote that myths are the dreams of humanity, and nowhere is this more vivid than in the creatures that haunted medieval minds. These weren't just stories, they were mirrors reflecting the deepest layers of the human psyche. Take the dragon, its scales glistening with symbolic weight. Jung saw it as the ultimate archetype of the shadow self, the parts of us we repress or deny, our untamed rage or greed given monstrous form. When a knight fought a dragon in legend, it wasn't just a battle against a beast, it was an allegory for confronting the chaos within. Even today, therapists use dragon imagery in narrative therapy, helping patients visualize their struggles as creatures to be understood rather than foes to slay. One client described their anxiety as a dragon coiled around my chest, and by naming it, they began to loosen its grip. Now consider the unicorn, its horn gleaming like a beacon in the dark. Jungians interpret it as the self-archetype, a symbol of wholeness and purity that exists beyond the messiness of reality. Medieval artists didn't just paint unicorns because they were pretty. They were grappling with an ideal, a yearning for something uncorrupted in a world of suffering. Modern advertisers still tap into this collective longing. Perfume bottles shaped like unicorn horns, skincare brands promising unicorn glow. These aren't accidents. They're selling the same medieval dream that purity in any form is worth chasing. But myths aren't just personal, they're cultural blueprints. Heraldry knew this instinctively. When a noble family stamped a griffin on their crest, they weren't just picking a cool monster. They were aligning themselves with its archetypal power. The griffin's vigilance, the lion's courage, the dragon's unyielding might. A knight wearing a basilisk emblem wasn't just accessorizing, he was broadcasting a warning: cross me, and my gaze will turn your ambitions to stone. These symbols worked because everyone, from peasants to kings, shared the same subconscious vocabulary. A dragon on a shield wasn't decoration, it was psychology in vivid color. The brilliance of these creatures lies in their duality. They're specific enough to feel real: a dragon's fiery breath, a unicorn's healing touch, yet vague enough to adapt to any era's anxieties. In the Middle Ages, a werewolf might represent fears of wilderness or madness. Today, werewolf stories often explore themes of identity or repressed desire. The monster hasn't changed, we have. And that's the magic of archetypes. They're like ancient vessels, constantly refilled with new meanings while never losing their original shape. As banners fluttered over medieval battlefields stitched with beasts of legend, they did more than identify factions. They proclaimed, "Here be the truths we all recognize, even if we've never spoken them aloud." And when we glimpse those same creatures now on movie screens, in corporate logos, in the stories we tell our children, they're still whispering the same question: what do you see when you stare into the monster's eyes? Your answer might surprise you. A knight's shield wasn't just armor, it was a story screaming in color and claw. Heraldry turned beasts into a language of power, where every griffin's talon and lion's roar carried coded messages about lineage, valor, and divine right. Take the Tudor dragon, its red wings unfurled like banners of conquest. When Henry VII marched to Bosworth Field in 1485, that dragon wasn't just decoration. It was propaganda stitched onto surcoats, proclaiming his mythical descent from King Arthur. The rules of heraldry were strict as chess. Metals like gold symbolized generosity, while colors like crimson shouted warriors' courage. Animals, they were personality tests in scale and feather. A lion rampant meant noble ferocity, its raised claws forever mid-strike. A griffin, split between eagle and lion, declared vigilance and unshakable strength, traits the Medici flaunted as they ruled Florence. Then there's the Habsburg double-headed eagle, one gaze fixed on the earthly realm, the other on the divine. This wasn't just a fancy logo, it was geopolitical branding. When the Habsburgs draped that eagle over castles from Madrid to Vienna, they were saying, "We see all, we rule both." Even today, traces linger. Russia's coat of arms still bears a similar eagle, a ghost of imperial ambition. Modern corporations unconsciously echo these tricks. Starbucks' siren, a direct descendant of maritime heraldry, luring customers instead of sailors. The Ferrari stallion, a prancing horse once painted on a World War I fighter plane, now screaming luxury and speed. But heraldry's beasts didn't just crown kings, they knelt in chapels. The Lamb of God bled into family crests, its gentle form countering dragons and wolves. In Notre Dame's stained glass, griffins clasped Bibles between their claws, their animal ferocity sanctified by purpose. A 15th century prayer book from Burgundy shows a unicorn resting its head in the Virgin Mary's lap, the hunt scene rewritten as redemption. These creatures weren't just symbols, they were theology in fur and feather, whispering that even the wildest beasts could serve grace. Yet for all their guilt and gospel, heraldic animals held a dark edge. The dragon slayer St. George might adorn England's flag, but in Eastern Europe, the same creature coiled around shields as a defender, not a foe. The message, power isn't just about conquest, it's about who gets to write the legend. And as these emblems seeped from battlefields into cathedrals, another transformation began. The beasts of war becoming beasts of worship, their roars softening into hymns. High above the pews of medieval churches, where saints gazed beatifically from stained glass, another kind of creature lurked in the shadows, grotesques with twisted limbs and gaping mouths, their stone eyes tracking every sinner below. These weren't mere decorations, they were sermons carved in rock. Take the apocalyptic beast of Revelation, its 7 heads writhing across tympanums like a nightmare given form. Artists rendered it with leopard spots, bear's claws, and lion's jaws, a Frankenstein's monster of predation, its very anatomy screaming heresy and chaos. Yet just a few feet away, you might find a dragon kneeling at the feet of Saint Margaret, its once terrifying wings now folded in submission. The message was unmistakable. Evil could be conquered, but only through faith. The Tarasque embodies this duality perfectly. This 6-legged, turtle-shelled terror ravaged Provence until Saint Martha tamed it not with a sword, but with hymns and holy water. In the town of Tarascon, annual festivals still reenact its redemption. The monster paraded through streets like a reformed criminal. Church carvings immortalize the moment, the Tarasque snarl softening to a dopey grin, its chains held loosely by a saint who looks more like a kindly schoolmarm than a dragon slayer. Here, the monster wasn't just defeated, it was transformed, proof that even the most savage forces could bow to divine grace. Then there's the Lamb of God, its gentle face emblazoned on altars and vestments. Unlike the Serpent of Eden, that slick-tongued tempter coiled around the Tree of Knowledge, the Lamb carried no threat, only sacrifice. Its innocence was a visual counterpoint to the hellish menagerie slithering across cathedral gutters. A 13th century psalter from Canterbury juxtaposes them starkly. On one page, the Lamb rests on an illuminated G, its halo glowing like a miniature sun. On the facing page, a basilisk stares back, its eyes hollow pits. The lesson, salvation and sin were always at war, and every soul was the battlefield. But how did these creatures leap from scripture to stone? Part of the answer lies in the medieval mind's hunger for tangibility. Abstract sins like greed or lust were hard to preach against. A dragon hoarding gold or a succubus whispering in the dark made them visceral. A worn-out farmer might ignore a sermon on vanity, but when he looked up to see a mermaid clutching her mirror, her tail crushing a sinking ship, the warning suddenly stuck. Even the placement of these carvings was strategic. Chimeras and demons clustered near doorways as if to say, "Leave your sins outside." Gargoyles weren't just rain spouts, they were spiritual scarecrows, their grotesque faces warding off evil like farmers' straw men scared birds from crops. Science now offers its own explanations. The Tarasque's crocodile-like description suggests encounters with Nile crocodiles during the Crusades, their features exaggerated through terrified retellings. The Beast of Revelation's patchwork anatomy, possibly inspired by Roman menageries, where exotic animals were displayed together for the first time, their unfamiliar forms blending in the popular imagination. And the Serpent of Eden, its forked tongue and limbless body made it the perfect villain, a creature that literally couldn't walk upright, forever separated from humanity's divine stature. Yet for all their theological weight, these beasts never lost their humanity. In the end, they were mirrors, sometimes showing the darkness we feared, other times the redemption we craved. And as the last echoes of their stone roars fade from the cathedral walls, another question rises. If these creatures were born from our deepest fears and hopes, what does that say about the monsters we're crafting today? Imagine stumbling upon a narwhal tusk washed ashore in the Middle Ages, a spiraled spear of bone longer than a man, glinting like ivory under the northern sun. To a medieval scholar, this wasn't just a curiosity, it was proof that somewhere in the icy waters beyond the map's edge, unicorns roamed the waves, their horns bobbing like masts of ghost ships. This collision of fossil and folklore wasn't accidental. When ancient Greeks unearthed elephant skulls on Crete, the massive central cavity where the trunk attached looked eerily like a single eye socket birthplace of the Cyclops myth. Even the towering remains of woolly mammoths, their curved tusks jutting from Siberian permafrost, might have inspired tales of giants whose bones littered the earth. Medieval bestiaries doubled as early scientific texts, their pages teeming with creatures like the manticore, likely a mangled account of a Bengal tiger, or the bonacan, a bison whose defensive diarrhea was exaggerated into a flamethrower. These weren't flights of fancy, they were attempts to catalogue the natural world with the tools available. Take the Physiologus, a 2nd century manuscript that described real animals alongside mythical ones, all under the same authoritative tone. A whale became a treacherous island that drowned sailors when it dove, a plausible explanation for disappearances at sea. When travelers returned from the east with tales of rhinos, scribes fused them with unicorn lore, creating armored beasts with cloven hooves and healing horns. The line between observation and legend was porous as parchment. Fast forward to modern cryptozoology, and the pattern repeats. The same impulse that turned narwhal tusks into unicorn horns now fuels searches for Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster. Sonar blips become serpentine necks, blurry photos morph into living fossils. The difference: medieval scholars lacked carbon dating and DNA analysis, but their curiosity mirrored ours, an insatiable drive to explain the unexplained, even if it meant stitching together fragments of truth and speculation. And just as fossils once breathed life into myths, pop culture resurrects them anew. The unicorns of today's fantasy, sparkly, pastel-maned creatures, are a far cry from the healing beasts of medieval lore, yet their DNA remains. In Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, the Erumpent's explosive horn nods to the unicorn's duality, a weapon and a wonder. Video games like The Witcher 3 let players hunt creatures straight from bestiary pages, their designs tweaked for modern screens but their essence intact. Even documentaries frame the search for real-life dragons, like the Komodo dragon, as a continuation of that ancient quest to pin down the creatures that once lived at the edges of our understanding. What ties these threads together isn't just mistaken identity, but longing. Whether it's a 13th century monk sketching a griffin or a biologist scanning Loch Ness for plesios or echoes, we're still chasing the same thrill. The moment when the world cracks open just wide enough to reveal something older, wilder, and far more strange than we dared imagine. And as CGI dragons soar across multiplex screens, they carry with them the whispers of those first fossil hunters, the ones who held a narwhal tusk in trembling hands and swore, against all reason, that magic was real. Roll a 20-sided die in any Dungeons & Dragons campaign, and you're not just playing a game, you're stepping into a living bestiary. The owlbear's screech, the gelatinous cube's silent ooze, the beholder's floating menace. These creatures didn't spring from thin air. They're direct descendants of medieval nightmares, repackaged with hit points and armor classes. When Gary Gygax co-created D&D in the 1970s, he didn't invent monsters. He codified them, plucking griffins from heraldry and liches from Slavic folklore, then giving them stat blocks as precise as tax forms. The game's original monster manual reads like a medieval scholar's fever dream, with manticores cribbed from Persian myths and rust monsters evoking alchemists' fears of decay. What makes D&D revolutionary isn't just its gameplay, it's how it turned folklore into a shared language, where a teenage kid in Ohio and a veteran game master in Norway can both shudder at the same description. You hear wings. Large wings. Netflix's The Witcher takes this resurrection further, dragging Slavic creatures from dusty archives into HD. The Chimera, a swamp-dwelling horror with too many legs, was once a cautionary tale whispered in Polish villages to keep children from straying into marshes. Now it's a CGI spectacle gutting soldiers in a murky pond, its chittering mandibles splattering mud across the screen. Showrunner Lauren Schmidt-Hissrich didn't just adapt Anders Sapkowski's books. She weaponized their folklore, making monsters metaphors for human folly. Striga isn't just a cursed princess. She's the physical manifestation of political betrayal, her claws shredding the lies of kings. Even the humble godling, a trickster spirit straight from Czech fables, becomes a commentary on displaced cultures, squatting in Novigrad's slums like a refugee from a dying world. Walk through any toy aisle today, and you'll see the commercial alchemy of these myths. Funko Pop, vinyl figures reduce basilisks to big-eyed collectibles, while plush griffins nestle next to teddy bears. The marketing genius lies in their duality. They're safe enough for a child's bedtime, yet coded with just enough edge to appeal to adult nostalgia. LEGO's medieval blacksmith set doesn't just include a dragon, it's a brick-built homage to the lanternworm legend, complete with a sword-wielding minifigure knight. Even the surge in fantasy cooking channels where creators brew mead or roast boar like a tavern keeper ties back to this hunger for tactile connection with imagined worlds. A molded plastic unicorn isn't just a toy, it's a totem, a way to hold the intangible. Fan cultures have become the new monasteries, preserving and remixing these legends with monkish devotion. Reddit threads dissect the taxonomy of Elder Scrolls dragons like medieval scholars debating angel hierarchies. Cosplayers stitch together historically accurate gambesons to wear under their Witcher medallions, blending 15th century tailoring with monster hunter chic. At conventions, panels on the real mythology behind God of War draw crowds as large as celebrity Q and as. This isn't passive consumption, it's participatory mythmaking, where every fan art sketch or homebrew D&D campaign adds another stitch to the tapestry. Beneath the entertainment value, though, lies something profound. These creatures are stealth educators. A kid who memorizes D&D's monster manual unknowingly learns comparative mythology, spotting how the Japanese Oni mirrors the Norse frost giant. A viewer binging Shadow and Bone absorbs snippets of Russian folk tales through the exploits of the Volcra. Even theme parks get in on the Act Universal's Dark Universe. Attractions weave authentic European werewolf lore into their jump scares. The monsters that once taught morality now teach cultural literacy, bridging gaps between eras and continents with the universal language of "what was that noise in the dark?" Yet for all their glossy modern adaptations, these creatures still carry the DNA of their origins. The dragons in House of the Dragon may have billion-dollar CGI, but their territorial fury echoes Beowulf. The werewolves of Twilight might sparkle, but their struggle between man and beast traces back to Petronius's Satyricon. What's changed isn't the monsters, it's us. Where medieval peasants saw the devil's work, we see psychology, sociology, or just a really cool boss fight. And as these legends keep evolving, they challenge us to ask, what fears will we dress in scales and fangs next? Imagine a classroom where the Black Death isn't just a dry statistic in a textbook, but a visceral, clawed nightmare stalking the pages of a student's handmade bestiary. This is the power of teaching history through myth, turning dates and treaties into living, breathing stories that cling to the imagination. When a 7th grader sketches their own version of the Pest Maiden, a Slavic folklore spirit said to spread plague with her tattered robes, they're not just memorizing timeline. They're grappling with the terror of an era where medicine was magic and death was a specter at every door. One of the most effective exercises, tasking students with creating their own illuminated bestiary entries. Provide them with a list of real medieval creatures, the gold-hoarding dragon, the purity-testing unicorn, then challenge them to invent a new beast that embodies a historical event or social issue. A child designing a famine hound, its ribs protruding like ladder rungs, its howl summoning crop blights, is internalizing the desperation of the Little Ice Age far more deeply than any bullet point list could achieve. Teachers at the British Museum's Education Centre have reported students retaining 30% more historical context when lessons are framed through creature design, with one pupil even crafting a heresy hydra, its many heads spouting conflicting doctrines to mirror the chaos of the Protestant Reformation. But myths aren't just creative catalysts, they're cultural X-rays. Analyzing the allegories behind creatures like the Chimera reveals how medieval people processed existential threats. That grotesque lion-goat-serpent hybrid wasn't random. Its stitched-together body mirrored the Church's fear of heresy, a monstrous blending of doctrines that threatened societal order. Similarly, the surge in werewolf trials during peasant revolts speaks volumes about how elites weaponized folklore to demonize the disenfranchised. A lesson comparing woodcuts of werewolves to propaganda pamphlets from the German Peasants' War can spark startlingly modern debates about misinformation and dehumanization. Modern educators are tapping into this same narrative magic. The storyline method used in Scottish schools builds entire curricula around immersive roleplay where students become medieval scribes documenting first-hand encounters with mythical beasts. In one case, a class investigating the lantern worm legend uncovered parallels to local river pollution, linking 12th century fears of poisoned waters to contemporary environmental activism. Digital tools like Twine even let students code interactive tales where choices determine whether a village survives a dragon's wrath or succumbs to greed, a dynamic way to explore cause and effect in historical crises. Preserving these stories isn't just about nostalgia, it's about safeguarding a linguistic toolkit for understanding humanity. The same archetypes that helped a medieval farmer comprehend the randomness of plague, the capricious fairies who stole healthy children, the vengeful spirits in the marsh resurface today in pandemic metaphors, where viruses are invisible goblins or vaccines heroic potions. By tracing these threads across time, students glimpse the unbroken tapestry of human coping mechanisms. A teenager comparing memes about COVID to broadsheets about the Black Death isn't just studying history. They're recognizing that every generation conjures its own monsters to face the darkness. The challenge now, ensuring these myths don't fossilize under glass. Oral storytelling festivals where students perform their own versions of medieval tales with modern twists keep the tradition alive. Libraries host monster manuscript workshops, teaching kids to grind pigments like medieval scribes while discussing how ink recipes traveled along trade routes. Even augmented reality apps now overlay cathedral gargoyles with holographic backstories, turning stone guardians into interactive history lessons, because the true magic of these creatures was never in their claws or wings. It was in their ability to make the past pulse with relevance, one unforgettable story at a time. Once upon a time, folklore lived in the breath of storytellers and the margins of hand-illuminated manuscripts. Today, it pulses through fiber optic cables and glows on smartphone screens. The British Library's digitization project is a modern-day scriptorium, where high-resolution scans of medieval bestiaries bloom under virtual magnifying glasses. With a click, anyone can zoom into the Inkai whiskers of a marginalia dragon or trace the gold leaf on a unicorn's horn, details even medieval scholars might have missed. These aren't just static images. Interactive annotations unpack symbolism, linking the griffin's split nature to contemporary debates about duality in identity. It's preservation with a twist. Technology isn't replacing tradition, it's giving it new wings. Yet for every manuscript saved in the cloud, countless oral tales teeter on the edge of silence. The Welsh Mabinogion, Norse skaldic poetry, Serbian epics chanted to the gusle, these were living performances, shaped by each teller's inflection and audience's gasps. Apps like StoryKeep attempt to capture this rhythm, allowing elders to record folktales with geotags marking where they were first heard. YouTube channels like Folklore Thursday blend animation and narration, turning Hungarian Tolto's horse shapeshifters into viral shorts. But the challenge remains, how to digitize the crackle of a hearthside voice, the way a Breton storyteller might lower their tone when the Ankou, death's harbinger, rattles his bone wagon. The stakes are higher than nostalgia. When Amazon's Alexa mispronounces Celtic deity names or autocorrect flattens dialect words into uniformity, we risk losing not just stories but entire worldviews. A medieval bestiaries manticore wasn't just a monster, it encoded fears of the foreign. Today, projects like the Endangered Languages Archive fight this erosion, pairing linguists with last speakers to safeguard idioms that hold unique mythic concepts. In northern Finland, Sami Joik, singing a tradition where melodies are the spiritual essence of people, animals, and landscape, is being preserved through 3D audio recordings that capture the reverberation of sacred valleys. Here's where viewers become heroes. Citizen science platforms like Zooniverse let anyone transcribe crumbling witch trial records, uncovering forgotten beast lore. TikTok trends like #medieval creature challenge invite users to reimagine mythical beings with modern twists. A basilisk recast as a cyberbully, its gaze freezing screens instead of flesh. Local libraries train teens to record grandparents narrating regional legends, creating digital time capsules. Even gaming plays a role. Assassin's Creed Valhalla consulted medievalists to embed Norse myths authentically, while modders for Minecraft rebuild cathedral gargoyles block by block. The magic lies in hybridity, a digital mead hall where parchment and pixels coexist. As we swipe through tales older than nations, we're not just saving folklore, we're proving that stories like the Phoenix refuse to stay ashes. And perhaps that's the most medieval idea of all, that the best endings aren't endings at all, but bridges to the next teller, the next era, the next flickering screen in the dark.